Chapter 5 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 5. Roses and Thorns. "Oh, what is it? What has happened?" cried Clover, starting up in bed the next morning as a clanging sound roused her suddenly from sleep. It was only the rising bell, ringing at the end of Quaker Row. Katy held her watch up to the dim light. She could just see the hands. Yes, they pointed to 6. It was actually morning. She and Clover jumped up and began to dress as fast as possible. "We've only got half an hour," said Clover, unhooking the rules and carrying them to the window. "Half an hour, and this says that we must turn the mattress, smooth the undersheet over the bolster, and spend 5 minutes in silent devotion. We'll have to be quick to do all that besides dressing ourselves." It is never easy to be quick when one is in a hurry. Everything sets itself against you. Fingers turn into thumbs, dresses won't button, nor pins keep their place. With all their haste, Katy and Clover were barely ready when the second bell sounded. As they hastened downstairs, Katy fastening her breastpin and Clover her cuffs, they met other girls, some looking half asleep, some half dressed, all yawning, rubbing their eyes and complaining of the early hour. "Isn't it horrid?" said Lily Page, hurrying by with no collar on and her hair hastily tucked into a net. "I never get up till 9 o'clock when I'm at home. Ma saves my breakfast for me. She says I shall have my sleep out while I have the chance." "You don't look quite awake now," remarked Clover. "No, because I haven't washed my face. Half the time I don't before breakfast. There's that old mattress that has to be turned, and when I sleep over I just do that first and then scramble my clothes on best way I can, anything not to be marked." After prayers and breakfasts were done, the girls had half an hour for putting their bedrooms to rights, during which interval it is to be hoped that Lily found time to wash her face. After that lessons began, and lasted till 1 o'clock. Dinner followed, with an hour's recreation. Then the bell rang for silent study hour, when the girls sat with their books in their bedrooms, but were not allowed to speak to each other. Next came a walk. "Who are you going to walk with?" asked Rose Red, meeting Clover in Quaker Row. "I don't know. Katy, I guess." "Are you really? You and she like each other, don't you? Do you know you're the first sisters I ever knew at school who did? Generally they quarrel awfully. The Stearns girls, who were here last term, scarcely spoke to each other. They didn't even room together, and Sarah Stearns was always telling tales against Sue and Sue against Sarah." "How disgusting! I never heard of anything so mean," cried Clover indignantly. "Why, I wouldn't tell tales about Katy if we quarreled ever so much. We never do, though. Katy is so sweet." "I suppose she is," said Rose rather doubtfully, "but do you know, I'm sort of afraid of her. It's because she's so tall. Tall people always scare me. And then she looks so grave and grown up. Don't tell her I said so, though, for I want her to like me." "Oh, she isn't a bit grave or grown up. She's the funniest girl in the world. Wait till you know her," replied loyal Clover. "I'd give anything if I could walk with you part of this term," went on Rose, putting her arm around Clover's waist. "But you see, unluckily, I'm engaged straight through. All of us old girls are. I walk with May Mather this week and next, then Esther Dearborn for a month, then Lily Page for 2 weeks, and all the rest of the time with Mary. I can't think why I promised Lily. I'm sure I don't want to go with her. I'd ask Mary to let me off, only I'm afraid she'd feel bad. I say, suppose we engage now to walk with each other for the first half of next term." "Why, that's not till October," said Clover. "I know it, but it's nice to be beforehand. Will you?" "Of course I will, provided that Katy has somebody pleasant to go with," replied Clover, immensely flattered at being asked by the popular Rose. They ran downstairs and took their places in the long procession of girls, who were ranged 2 and 2, ready to start. Miss Jane walked at the head, and Miss Marsh, another teacher, brought up the rear. Rose Red whispered that it was like a funeral and a caravan mixed, as cheerful as hearses at both ends, and wild beasts in the middle. The walk was along a wooded road, a mile out and a mile back. The procession was not permitted to stop or straggle, or take any of the liberties which make walking pleasant. Still, Katy and Clover enjoyed it. There was a spring smell in the air, and the woods were beginning to be pretty. They even found a little trailing arbutus blossoming in a sunny hollow. Lily was just in front of them and amused them with histories of different girls, whom she pointed out in the long line. That was Esther Dearborn, Rose Red's friend. Handsome, wasn't she, but awfully sarcastic. The 2 next were Amy Alsop and Ellen Gray. They always walked together because they were so intimate. Yes, they were nice enough, only so distressingly good. Amy did not get 1 single mark last term. That child with pigtails was Bella Arkwright. Why on earth did Katy want to know her? She was a nasty little thing." "She's just about Elsie's height," replied Katy. "Who's that pretty girl with pink velvet on her hat?" "Dear me, do you think she's pretty? I don't. Her name is Louisa Agnew. She lives at Ashburn, quite near us, but we don't know them. Her family are not at all in good society." "What a pity. She looks sweet and ladylike." Lily tossed her head. "They're quite common people," she said. "They live in a little mite of a house, and her father paints portraits." "But I should think that would be nice. Doesn't she ever take you to see his pictures?" "Take me?" cried Lily indignantly. "I should think not. I tell you we don't visit. I just speak when we're here, but I never see her when I'm at home." "Move on, young ladies. What are you stopping for?" cried Miss Jane. "Yes, move on," muttered Rose Red from behind. "Don't you hear, Policeman X?" From walking hour till tea time was recreation again. Lily improved this opportunity to call at number 6. She had waited to see how the girls were likely to take in school before committing herself to intimacy, but now that Rose Red had declared in their favor, she was ready to begin to be friendly. "How lovely," she said, looking about. "You got the end room after all, didn't you? What splendid times you'll have. Oh, how plainly you can see Barry Searle's window. Has he spoken to you yet?" "Spoken to us? Of course not. Why should he?" replied Katy. "He doesn't know us, and we don't know him." "That's nothing. Half the girls in the school bow and speak and carry on with young men they don't know. You won't have a bit of fun if you're so particular." "I don't want that kind of fun," replied Katy, with energy in her voice. "Neither does Clover. And I can't imagine how the girls can behave so. It isn't ladylike at all." Katy was very fond of this word, ladylike. She always laid great stress upon it. It seemed in some way to be connected with Cousin Helen, and to mean everything that was good and graceful and sweet. "Dear me, I'd no idea you were so dreadfully proper," said Lily, pouting. "Mother said you were as prim and precise as your grandmother, but I didn't suppose—" "How unkind!" broke in Clover, taking fire as usual at any affront to Katy. "Katy prim and precise! She isn't a bit. She's twice as much fun as the rest of you girls. But it's nice fun, not this horrid stuff about students. I wish your mother wouldn't say such things." She didn't, I don't mean exactly that," stammered Lily, frightened by Clover's indignant eyes. "All I meant was that Katy's dreadfully dignified for her age, and we bad girls will have to look out. You needn't be so mad, Clover. I'm sure it's very nice to be proper and good and set an example." "I don't want to preach to anybody," said Katy, coloring, "and I wasn't thinking about examples, but really and truly, Lily, wouldn't your mother and all the girls' mothers be shocked if they knew about these performances here?" "Gracious, I should think so. Ma would kill me. I wouldn't have her know of my goings-on for all the world." Just then Rose pulled out a drawer and called through to ask if Clover would please come in and help her a minute. Lily took advantage of her absence to say, "I came on purpose to ask you to walk with me for 4 weeks. Will you?" "Thank you, but I'm engaged to Clover." "To Clover? But she's your sister. You can get off." "I don't want to get off. Clover and I dearly like to go together." Lily stared. "Well, I never heard of such a thing," she said. "You're really romantic. The girls will call you the Inseparables." "I wouldn't mind being inseparable from Clover," said Katy, laughing. Next day was Saturday. It was nominally a holiday, but so many tasks were set for it that it hardly seemed like one. The girls had to practice in the gymnasium, to do their mending, and have all drawers in apple pie order before afternoon, when Miss Jane went through the rooms on a tour of inspection. Saturday also was the day for writing home letters. So altogether it was about the busiest of the week. Early in the morning Miss Jane appeared in Quaker Row with some slips of paper in her hand, one of which she left at each door. They told the hours at which the girls were to go to the bathhouse. "You will carry each a crash towel, a sponge, and soap," she announced to Katy, "and will be in the entry at the foot of the stairs at 25 minutes after 9 precisely. Failures in punctuality will be punished by a mark." Miss Jane always delivered her words like a machine, and closed her mouth with a snap at the end of a sentence. "Horrid thing! Don't I wish her missionary would come and carry her off? Not that I blame him for staying away," remarked Rose Red from her door, making a face at Miss Jane as she walked down the entry. "I don't understand about the bathhouse," said Katy. "Does it belong to us? And where is it?" "No, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Mr. Parrott, and anybody can use it. Only on Saturday it is reserved for us nuns. Haven't you ever noticed it when we've been out walking? It's in that street by the bakery, which we pass to take the Lebanon road. We go across the green and down by Professor Seacombe's, and we are in plain sight from the college all the way, and of course those abominable boys sit there with spy-glasses and stare as hard as ever they can. It's perfectly horrid. A crash towel, a sponge and soap, indeed! I wish I could make Miss Jane eat the pieces of soap which she has forced me to carry across this village." "Oh, Rose!" remonstrated Mary Silver. "Well, I do. And the crash towels afterward, by way of dessert," replied the incorrigible Rose. "Never mind. Just wait. A bright idea strikes me." "Oh? What?" cried the other three. But Rose only pursed up her mouth, arched her eyebrows, and vanished into her own room, locking the door behind her. Mary Silver, finding herself shut out, sat down meekly in the hall till such time as it should please Rose to open the door. This was not till the bath hour. As Katy and Clover went by, Rose put her head out, and called that she would be down in a minute. The bathing party consisted of 8 girls, with Miss Jane for escort. They were halfway across the common before Miss Jane noticed that everybody was shaking with stifled laughter, except Rose, who walked along demurely, apparently unconscious that there was anything to laugh at. Miss Jane looked sharply from one to another for a moment, then stopped short and exclaimed, "Rosamond Redding! How dare you?" "What is it, ma'am?" asked Rose, with the face of a lamb. "Your bath towel! Your sponge!" gasped Miss Jane. "Yes, ma'am, I have them all," replied the audacious Rose, putting her hand to her hat. There, to be sure, was the long crash towel, hanging down behind like a veil, while the sponge was fastened on one side like a great cockade, and in front appeared a cake of pink soap, neatly pinned into the middle of a black velvet bow. Miss Jane seized Rose and removed these ornaments in a twinkling. "We shall see what Mrs. Florence thinks of this conduct," she grimly remarked. Then, dropping the soap and sponge in her own pocket, she made Rose walk beside her, as if she were a criminal in custody. The bathhouse was a neat place, with 8 small rooms, well supplied with hot and cold water. Katy would have found her bath very nice, had it not been for the thought of the walk home. They must look so absurd, she reflected, with their sponges and damp towels. Miss Jane was as good as her word. After dinner, Rose was sent for by Mrs. Florence, and had an interview of 2 hours with her. She came out with red eyes, and shut herself into her room with a disconsolate bang. Before long, however, she revived sufficiently to tap on the drawers and push through a note with the following words: "My heart is broken. R.R." Clover hastened in to comfort her. Rose was sitting on the floor with a very clean pocket-handkerchief in her hand. She wept and put her head against Clover's knee. "I suppose I'm the nastiest girl in the world," she said. "Mrs. Florence thinks so. She said I was an evil influence in the school. Wasn't that unkind?" with a little sob. "I meant to be so good this term," she went on, "but what's the use? A codfish might as well try to play the piano. It was always so, even when I was a baby. Sylvia says I have got a little fiend inside of me. Is it that makes me so horrid?" Clover purred over her. She could not bear to have Rose feel badly. "Wasn't Miss Jane funny?" went on Rose, with a sudden twinkle. "And did you see Barry and Alfred Seacombe?" "No. Where were they?" "Close to us, standing by the fence. All the time Miss Jane was unpinning the towel they were splitting their sides, and Barry made such a face at me that I nearly laughed out. That boy has a perfect genius for faces. He used to frighten Sylvia and me into fits when we were little tots up here on visits." "Then you knew him before you came to school?" "Oh dear, yes. I know all the Hillsover boys. We used to make mud pies together. They're grown up now, most of 'em, and in college, and when we meet we're very dignified and say Miss Redding and Mr. Seacombe and Mr. Searles, but we're just as good friends as ever. When I go to take tea with Mrs. Seacombe, Alfred always invites Barry to drop in, and we have the greatest fun. Mrs. Florence won't let me go this term, though, I guess, she's so mad about the towel." Katy was quite relieved when Clover reported this conversation. Rose, for all her wickedness, seemed to be a little lady. Katy did not like to class her among the girls who flirted with students whom they did not know. It was wonderful how soon they all settled down and became accustomed to their new life. Before 6 weeks were over, Katy and Clover felt as if they had lived at Hillsover for years. This was partly because there was so much to do. Nothing makes time fly like having every moment filled and every hour set apart for a distinct employment. They made several friends, chief among whom were Ellen Gray and Louisa Agnew. This last intimacy Lily resented highly, and seemed to consider as an affront to herself. With no one, however, was Katy so intimate as Clover was with Rose Red. This cost Katy some jealous pangs at first. She was so used to considering Clover her own exclusive property that it was not easy to share her with another, and she had occasional fits of feeling resentful and injured, and left out. These were but momentary, however. Katy was too healthy of mind to let unkind feelings grow, and by she grew fond of Rose and Rose of her, so that in the end the sisters shared the friend, as they did other nice things, and neither of them was jealous of the other. But charming as she was, A certain price had to be paid for the pleasure of intimacy with Rose. Her overflowing spirits and the little fiend inside her were always provoking scrapes, in which her friends were apt to be more or less involved. She was very penitent and afflicted after these scrapes, but it didn't make a bit of difference. The next time she was just as naughty as ever. "What are you?" said Katy one day, meeting her in the hall with a heap of black shawls and aprons on her arm. "Hush!" whispered Rose mysteriously. "Don't say a word. Senator Brown is dead, our senator, you know. I'm going to put my window into mourning for him, that's all. It's a proper token of respect." 2 hours later, Mrs. Nipson, walking sedately across the common, noticed quite a group of students in the president's yard looking up at the nunnery. She drew nearer. They were admiring Rose's window, hung with black and decorated with a photograph of the deceased senator, suspended in the middle of a wreath of weeping willow. Of course, she hurried upstairs and tore down the shawls and aprons, and equally of course, Rose had a lecture and a mark. But dear me, what good did it do? The next day but one, as Katy and Clover sat together in silent study hour, their lower drawer was pushed open very noiselessly and gently till it came out entirely and lay on the floor, and in the aperture thus formed appeared Rose's saucy face, flushed with mischief. She was crawling through from her own room. "Such fun!" she whispered. "I never thought of this before. We can have parties in study hours and all sorts of things." "Oh, go back, Rosie," whispered Clover in agonized entreaty, though laughing all the time. "Go back? Not at all. I'm coming in," answered Rose, pulling herself through a little farther. But at that moment the door opened. There stood Miss Jane. She had caught the buzz of voices as she passed in the hall, and had entered to see what was going on. Rose, dreadfully frightened, made a rapid movement to withdraw, but the space was narrow and she had wedged herself and could move neither backward nor forward. She had to submit to being helped through by Miss Jane in a series of pulls, while Katy and Clover sat by, not daring to laugh or to offer assistance. When Rose was on her feet, Miss Jane released her with a final shake, which she seemed unable to refrain from giving. "Go to your room," she said. "I shall report all of you young ladies for this flagrant act of disobedience." Rose went, and in 2 minutes the drawer, which Miss Jane had replaced, opened again, and there was this note: "If I'm never heard of more, give my love to my family and mention how I died. I forgive my enemies and leave Clover my band bracelet. My blessings on you both. With the deepest regard, your afflicted friend, R.R." Mrs. Florence was very angry on this occasion, and would listen to no explanations, but gave Katy and Clover a disobedience mark also. This was very unfair, and Rose felt dreadfully about it. She begged and entreated, but Mrs. Florence only replied, "There is blame on both sides, I have no doubt." "She's entirely changed from what she used to be," declared Rose. "I don't know what's the matter. I don't like her half so much as I did." The truth was that Mrs. Florence had secretly determined to give up her connection with the school at midsummer, and regarding it now rather as Mrs. Nipson's school than her own, she took no pains to study character or mete out justice carefully among scholars with whom she was not likely to have much to do. End of chapter 5. Of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School, by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 6. The SSUC. It was Saturday afternoon, and Clover, having finished her practicing, dusting, and mending, had settled herself in number 6 for a couple of hours of quiet enjoyment. Everything was in beautiful order to meet Miss Jane's inspecting eye, and Clover, as she sat in the rocking-chair, writing case in lap, looked extremely cozy and comfortable. A half-finished letter to Elsie lay in the writing-case, but Clover felt lazy, and instead of writing was looking out of the window in a dreamy way to where Barry Searles and some other young men were playing ball in the yard below. She was not thinking of them or of anything else in particular. A vague sense of pleasant idleness possessed her, and it was like the breaking of a dream when the door opened and Katy came in, not quietly after her wont, but with a certain haste and indignant rustle, as if vexed by something. When she saw Clover at the window she cried out hastily, "Oh, Clover, don't!" "Don't what?" asked Clover without turning her head. "Don't sit there looking at those boys." "Why? Why not?" "They can't see me. The blinds are shut." "No matter for that. It's just as bad as if they could see you. Don't do it. I can't bear to have you." "Well, I won't then. said Clover, good-humouredly, facing round with her back to the window. "I wasn't looking at them either, not exactly. I was thinking about Elsie and John, and wondering— But what's the matter, Katy? What makes you fire up so about it? You've watched the ball playing yourself plenty of times." "I know I have, and I didn't mean to be cross, Clovy. The truth is, I'm all put out. These girls with incessant talk about the students make me absolutely sick. It is so unladylike and so bad, especially for the little ones. Fancy that little mite of a Carrie Steele informing me that she is in love with Harry Crosby. In love! A baby like that! She has no business to know that there is such a thing." "Yes," said Clover, laughing. "She wrote his name on a wintergreen lozenge, and bored a hole and hung it round her neck on a blue ribbon, but it melted and stuck to her frock, and she had to take it off." "Whereupon she ate it," added Rose, who came in at that moment. The girls shouted, but Katy soon grew grave. "One can't help laughing," she said. "But isn't it a shame to have such things going on? Just fancy our Elsie behaving so, Clover. Why, papa would have a fit. I declare I've a great mind to get up a society to put down flirting." "Do," said Rose. "What fun it would be! Call it the Society for the Suppression of Young Men. I'll join." "You indeed," replied Katy, shaking her head. "Didn't I see Barry Searles throw a bunch of syringia into your window only this morning?" "Dear me, did he? I shall have to speak to Mary again. It's quite shocking to have her go on so. But really and truly, do let us have a society. It would be so jolly. We could meet on Saturday afternoons, and write pieces, and have signals, and a secret, as Sylvia's society did when she was at school. Get one up, Katy, that's a dear." "But," said Katy, taken aback by having her random idea so suddenly adopted, "if I did get one up, it would be in real earnest, and it would be a society against flirting. And you know you can't help it, Rosie." "Yes, I can. You are doing me great injustice. I don't behave like those girls in Attic Row. I never did. I just bow to Barry and the rest whom I really know, never to anybody else. And you must see, Catherine, darling, that it would be the height of ingratitude if I didn't bow to the boys who made mud pies for me when I was little, and lent me their marbles, and did all sorts of kind things. Now, wouldn't it?" coaxingly. "Perhaps," admitted Katy with a smile. "But you're such a witch." "I'm not. Indeed I'm not. I'll be a pillar of society if only you'll provide a society for me to be a pillar of. Now, Katy, do, oh, do." When Rose was in a coaxing mood, few people could resist her. Katy yielded, and between jest and earnest the matter was settled. Katy was to head the plan and invite the members. "Only a few at first," suggested Rose. "When it is proved to be a success and everybody wants to join, we can let in 2 or 3 more as a great favor. What shall the name be? We'll keep it a secret, whatever it is. There's no fun in a society without a secret." What should the name be? Rose invented half a dozen, each more absurd than the last. The Aunty Jane Society would sound well, she insisted. Or no, the Put Him Down Club was better yet. Finally they settled upon the Society for the Suppression of Unladylike Conduct. "Only we'll never use the whole name," said Rose. "We'll say the S.S.U.C. That sounds brisk and snappy, and will drive the whole school wild with curiosity. What larks! How I long to begin!" The next Saturday was fixed upon for the first meeting. During the week Katy proposed the plan to the elect few, all of whom accepted enthusiastically. Lily Page was the only person who declined. She said it would be stupid, that for her part she didn't set up to be proper or better than she was, and that in any case she shouldn't wish to be mixed up in a society of which Miss Agnew was a member. The girls did not break their hearts over this refusal. They had felt obliged to ask her for relationship's sake, but everybody was a little relieved that she did not wish to join. Number 6 looked very full indeed that Saturday afternoon when the S.S.U.C. came together for the first time. 10 members were present. Mary Silver and Louisa were 2, and Rose's crony Esther Dearborn another. The remaining 4 were Sally Alsop and Amy Erskine, Alice Gibbons, one of the new scholars, whom they all liked but did not know very well, and Ellen Gray, a pale, quiet girl with droll blue eyes, a comical twist to her mouth, and a trick of saying funny things in such a demure way that half the people who listened never found out that they were funny. All Rose's chairs had been borrowed for the occasion. 3 girls sat on the bed and 3 on the floor. With a little squeezing there was plenty of room for everybody. Katy was chosen president, and requested to take the rocking chair as a sign of office. This she did with much dignity, and proceeded to read the constitution and bylaws of the society, which had been drawn up by Rose Red and copied on an immense sheet of blue paper. They ran thus: Constitution for the Society for the Suppression of Unladylike Conduct, known to the uninitiated as the S.S.U.C. Article 1. The object of this society is twofold. It combines having a good time with the pursuit of virtue. Article 2. The good time is to take place once a week in number 6 Quaker Row, between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. Article 3. The nature of the good time is to be decided upon by committee to be appointed each Saturday by the members of the society. Article 4. Virtue is to be pursued at all times and in all seasons by the members of the society, setting their faces against the practice of bowing and speaking to young gentlemen who are not acquaintances, waving of pocket handkerchiefs, signals from windows, and any species of conduct which would be thought unladylike by nice people anywhere, and especially by the mammas of the society. Article 5. The members of the society pledge themselves to use their influence against these practices, both by precept and example. In witness whereof we sign Catherine Carr, President; Rosamond Redding, Secretary; Clover E. Carr, Mary L. Silver, Esther Dearborn, Sally P. Alsop, Amy W. Erskine, Alice Gibbons, Ellen Whitworth Gray. Next followed the bylaws. Katy had not been able to see the necessity of having any bylaws, but Rose had insisted. She had never heard of a society without them, she said, and she didn't think it would be legal to leave them out. It had cost her some trouble to invent them, but at last they stood thus. Bylaw number 1. The members of the S.S.U.C. will observe the following signals. First, the grip. This is given by inserting the first and middle finger of the right hand between the thumb and fourth finger of the respondent's left, and describing a rotatory motion in the air with the little finger. Nota bene. Much practice is necessary to enable members to exchange this signal in such a manner as not to attract attention. Second, the signal of danger. This signal is for use when Miss Jane or any other foe-woman heaves into sight. It consists in rubbing the nose violently, and at the same time giving 3 stamps on the floor with the left foot. It must be done with an air of unconsciousness. Third, the signal for consultation. This signal is for use when immediate communication is requisite between members of the society. It consists of a pinch on the back of the right hand, accompanied by the word Holofernes pronounced in a low voice. Bylaw number 2. The members of the S.S.U.C. pledge themselves to inviolable secrecy about all society proceedings. Bylaw number 3. The members of the S.S.U.C. will bring their Saturday cornballs to swell the common entertainment. Bylaw number 4. Members having boxes from home are at liberty to contribute such part of the contents as they please to the aforementioned common entertainment. Here the bylaws ended. There was much laughter over them, especially over the last. "Why did you put that in, Rosie?" asked Ellen Gray. "It strikes me as hardly necessary." "Oh," replied Rose, "I put that in to encourage Silvery Mary there. She's expecting a box soon, and I knew that she would pine to give the society a share, but would be too timid to propose it, so I thought I would just pave the way." "How truly kind," laughed Clover. "Now," said the president, "the entertainment of the meeting will begin by the reading of Trailing Arbutus, a poem by C.E.C." Clover had been very unwilling to read the first piece, and had only yielded after much coaxing from Rose, who had bestowed upon her in consequence the name of Quintia Curtia. She felt very shy as she stood up with her paper in hand, and her voice trembled perceptibly, but after a minute she grew used to the sound of it, and read steadily. Trailing Arbutus. I always think when looking at its mingled rose and white of the pink lips of children put up to say good night. Cuddled its green leaves under, like babies in their beds, its blossoms shy and sunny conceal their pretty heads. And when I lift the blanket up and peep inside of it, they seem to give me smile for smile, nor be afraid a bit. Dear little flower, the earliest of all the flowers that are, twinkling upon the bare brown earth as on the clouds a star. How can we fail to love it well, or prize it more and more? It is the first small signal that winter time is o'er. That spring has not forgotten us, though late and slow she be, but is upon her flying way, and we her face shall see. This production caused quite a sensation among the girls. They had never heard any of Clover's verses before, and thought these wonderful. "Why," cried Sally Alsop, "it is almost as good as Tupper." Sally meant this for a great compliment, for she was devoted to the proverbial philosophy. A poem by E.D. was the next thing on the list. Esther Dearborn rose with great pomp and dignity, cleared her throat, put on a pair of eyeglasses, and began. Miss Jane. Who ran to catch me on the spot, if I the slightest rule forgot, believing and excusing not? Miss Jane. Who lurked outside my door all day, in hopes that I would disobey, and some low whispered word would say? Miss Jane. Who caught our Rosebud halfway through the wall which parted her from two friends, and that small prank made her rue? Miss Jane. Who is our bane, our foe, our fear? Who's always certain to appear just when we do not think her near? Miss Jane. Who down the hall is creeping now with stealthy step, but knowing not how exactly to discover? Broke in Rose, improvising rapidly. Next moment came a knock at the door. It was Miss Jane. "Your drawers, Miss Carr, your cupboard," she said, going across the room and examining each in turn. There was no fault to be found with either, so she withdrew, giving the laughing girls a suspicious glance, and remarking that it was a bad habit to sit on beds. It always injured them. "Do you suppose she heard?" whispered Mary Silver. "No, I don't think she did," replied Rose. "Of course, she suspected us of being in some mischief or other. She always does that. Now, Mary, it's your turn to give us an intellectual treat. Begin." Poor Mary shrank back, blushing and protesting. "You know I can't," she said. "I'm too stupid." "Rubbish!" cried Rose. "You're the dearest girl that ever was." She gave Mary's shoulder a reassuring pat. "Mary is excused this time," put in Katy. "It is the first meeting, so I shall be indulgent. But after this every member will be expected to contribute something for each meeting. I mean to be very strict." "Oh, I never, never can," cried Mary. Rose was down on her at once. "Nonsense! Hush!" she said. "Of course you can. You shall, if I have to write it for you myself." "Order!" said the president, rapping on the table with a pencil. "Rose has something to read us." Rose stood up with great gravity. "I would ask for a moment's delay, that the society may get out its pocket handkerchiefs," she said. "My piece is an affecting one. I didn't mean it, but it came so. We cannot always be cheerful." Here she heaved a sigh which set the SSUC to laughing, and began. A Scotch Poem. Wee crimson tippet Willie Wink weighs me drear, dree and dra, a waeful thocht, a fearsome flea, a wother wind and a'. Sair, sair thy mither sabs her lane, her een, her moo are wat, her cauld kail hae the corbies ta'en, and grievously she grat. Ah me, the southering of the wind, ah me, the waesome mither, ah me, the bairnies left ahind, the shither, hither, blither. "What does it mean?" cried the girls, as Rose folded up the paper and sat down. "Mean?" said Rose. "I'm sure I don't know. It's Scotch, I tell you. It's the kind of thing that people read, and then they say, 'One of the loveliest gems that Burns ever wrote.' I thought I'd see if I couldn't do one too. Anybody can, I find. It's not at all difficult." All the poems having been read, Katy now proposed that they should play Word and Question. She and Clover were accustomed to the game at home, but to some of the others it was quite new. Each girl was furnished with a slip of paper and a pencil, and was told to write a word at the top of the paper, fold it over, and pass it to her next left-hand neighbor. "Dear me, I don't know what to write," said Mary Silver. "Oh, write anything," said Clover. So Mary obediently wrote anything and folded it over. "What next?" asked Alice Gibbons. "Now a question," said Katy. "Write it under the word and fold over again. No, Amy, not on the fold. Don't you see? If you do, the writing will be on the wrong side of the paper when we come to read." The questions were more troublesome than the words, and the girls sat frowning and biting their pencil tops for some minutes before all were done. As the slips were handed in, Katy dropped them into the lid of her work basket and thoroughly mixed and stirred them up. "Now," she said, passing it about, "each draw one, read, and write a rhyme in which the word is introduced and the question answered. It needn't be more than 2 lines unless you like. Here, Rose, it's your turn first." "Oh, what a hard game!" cried some of the girls, but pretty soon they grew interested and began to work over their verses. "I should uncommonly like to know who wrote this abominable word," said Rose in a tone of despair. "Clover, you rascal, I believe it was you." Clover peeped over her shoulder, nodded, and laughed. "Very well, then," snatching up Clover's slip and putting her own in its place, "you can just write on it yourself. I shan't. I never heard of such a word in my life. You made it up for the occasion, you know you did." "I didn't. It's in the Bible," replied Clover, setting to work composedly on the fresh paper. But when Rose opened Clover's slip she groaned again. "It's just as bad as the other," she cried. "Do change back again, Clovy, that's a dear." "No, indeed," said Clover, guarding her paper. "You've changed once, and now you must keep what you have." Rose made a face, chewed her pencil a while, and then began to write rapidly. For some minutes not a word was spoken. "I've done," said Esther Dearborn at last, flinging her paper into the basket lid. "So have I," said Katy. One by one the papers were collected and jumbled into a heap. Then Katy, giving all a final shake, drew out one, opened it, and read: Word, radishes. Question, how do you like your clergymen done? How do I like them done? Well, that depends. I like them done on sleepy, drowsy Sundays. I like them underdone on other days. Perhaps a little overdone on Mondays. But I always prefer them old as pa, and not like radishes, all red and raw. "Oh, what a rhyme!" cried Clover. "Well, what is one to do?" said Ellen Gray. Then she stopped and bit her lip, remembering that no one was supposed to know who wrote the separate papers. "Aha! It's yours, is it, Ellen?" said Rose. "You're an awfully clever girl and an ornament to the S.S.U.C. Go on, Katy." Katy opened the second slip. Word, anything. Question, would you rather be a greater fool than you seem, or seem a greater fool than you are? I wouldn't be a fool for anything, my dear, if I could help it, but I can't, I fear. Not bad, said Rose, nodding her head at Sally Alsop, who blushed crimson. The third paper ran: Word, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Question, does your mother know you're out? Rose and Clover exchanged looks. Why, of course my mother knows it, for she sent me out herself. She told me to run quickly, for it wasn't but a mile, but I found it was much farther, and my feet grew tired and weary, and I couldn't hurry greatly, so I took a long, long while. Beside, I stopped to read your word, a stranger one I never heard. I've met with papistical, that's Pat, but Maher Shalal Hashbaz, what's that? Oh, Clovy, you bright little thing, cried Rose in fits of laughter. But Mary Silver looked quite pale. I never heard of anything so awful, she said. If that word had come to me, I should have fainted away on the spot. I know I should. Next came Word, buttons. Question, what is the best way to make home happy? To me 'tis quite clear, I can answer this right. Sew on the buttons, and sew them on tight. I suspect that is Amy's, said Esther. She's such a model for mending and keeping things in order. It's not fair guessing aloud in this way, said Sally Alsop. Sally always spoke for Amy, and Amy for Sally. Voice and echo, Rose called them. Only, as she remarked, nobody could tell which was echo and which was voice. The next word was Mrs. Nipson, and the question, do you like flowers? Do I like flowers? I will not write a sonnet, singing their beauty as a poet might do. I just attest those on Aunt Nipson's bonnet, because they are like her, all gray and blue, dusty and pinched and fastened on askew, and as for heaven's own buttercups and daisies, I am not good enough to sing their praises. Nobody knew who wrote this verse. Katy suspected Louisa, and Rose suspected Katy. The sixth slip was a very brief one. Word, when. Question, are you willing? If I wasn't willing, I would tell you, but when, oh dear, I can't. What an extraordinary rhyme, began Clover, but Rose spied poor Mary blushing and looking distressed, and hastily interposed, it's very good, I'm sure. I wish I'd written it. Go on, Katy. So Katy went on. Word, unfeeling. Question, which would you rather do, or go fishing? I don't feel up to fishing or such, and so, if you please, I'd rather do which? I don't seem to see the word in that poem, said Rose. The distinguished author will please write another. The distinguished author made no reply to this suggestion, but after a minute or two Esther Dearborn, quite disinterestedly, as she stated, remarked that, after all, to don't feel was pretty much the same as unfeeling. There was a little chorus of groans at this, and Katy said she should certainly impose a fine if such dodges and evasions were practiced again. This was the first meeting, however, and she would be merciful. After this speech she unfolded another paper. It ran, Word, flee. Question, what would you do, love? What would I do, love? Well, I do not know. How can I tell till you are more explicit? If 'twere a rose you held me, I would smell it. If 'twere a mouth you held me, I would kiss it. If 'twere a frog, I'd scream then furies louder. If 'twere a flea, I'd fetch the lion's powder. Only two slips remained. One was Katy's own. She knew it by the way in which it was folded, and had almost instinctively avoided and left it for the last. Now, however, she took courage and opened it. The word was measles, and the question, who was the grandmother of invention? These were the lines. The night was horribly dark. The measles broke out in the ark. Little Japhar and Shem and all the young hams were screaming at once for potatoes and clams. What shall I do, said poor Mrs. Noah, all alone by myself in this terrible shower. I know what I'll do. I'll step down in the hold and wake up a lioness grim and old, and tie her close to the children's door, and give her a ginger cake to roar at the top of her voice for an hour or more. And I'll tell the children to cease their din, or I'll let that grim old party in, to stop their squeezels and likewise their measles. She practiced this with the greatest success. She was everyone's grandmother, I guess." "That's much the best of all," pronounced Alice Gibbons. "I wonder who wrote it." "Dear me, did you like it so much?" said Rose, simpering and doing her best to blush. "Did you really write it?" said Mary, but Louisa laughed and exclaimed, "No use, Rosie, you can't take us in. We know better." "Now for the last," said Katy. "The word is buckwheat, and the question, what is the origin of dreams?" "When the nuns are sweetly sleeping, Mrs. Nipson comes a-creeping, creeping like a kitty cat from door to door, as she listens to their slumbers, and most carefully she numbers, counting for every nun a nunlet snore. And the nuns in sweet forgetfulness who lie, dreaming of buckwheat cakes, parental love, and pie, moan softly, twist and turn, and see black cats and fiends who frolic in their glee, and nightmares prancing wildly do abound, while Mrs. Nipson makes her nightly round." "Who did write that?" exclaimed Rose. Nobody answered. The girls looked at each other, and Rose scrutinized them all with sharp glances. "Well, I never saw such creatures for keeping their countenances," she said. "Somebody is as bold as brass. Didn't you see how I blushed when my piece was read?" "You monkey," whispered Clover, who at that moment caught sight of the handwriting on the paper. Rose gave her a warning pinch, and the both subsided into an unseen giggle. "What, the tea bell?" cried everybody. "We wanted to play another game." "It's a complete success," whispered Rose ecstatically as they went down the hall. "The girls all say they never had such a good time in their lives. I'm so glad I didn't die with the measles when I was little." "Well," demanded Lily, "so the High and Mighty Society has had a meeting. How did it go off?" "Delicious," replied Rose, smacking her lips as at the recollection of something very nice. "But you mustn't ask any questions, Lily. Outsiders have nothing to do with the S.S.U.C. Our proceedings are strictly private." She ran downstairs with Katy. "I think you're real mean," called Lily after them. Then she said to herself, "They're just trying to tease. I know it was stupid." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 7. Injustice. Summer was always slow in getting to Hillsover, but at last she arrived, and woods and hills suddenly put on new colors and became beautiful. The sober village shared in the glorifying process. Vines budded on piazzas, wisteria purpled whitewashed walls. The brown elm boughs which hung above the common turned into trailing garlands of fresh green. Each walk revealed some change, or ended in some delightful discovery. Trilliums, dog-tooth violets, apple trees in blossom, or wild strawberries turning red. The woodflowers and mosses, even the birds and bird-songs, were new to our Western girls. Hillsover in summer was a great deal prettier than Burnet, and Katy and Clover began to enjoy school very much indeed. Toward the end of June, however, something took place which gave them quite a different feeling, something so disagreeable that I hate to tell about it, but as it really happened, I must. It was on a Saturday morning. They had just come upstairs, laughing and feeling very merry, for Clover had written a droll piece for the S.S.U.C. meeting, and was telling Katy about it, when just at the head of the stairs they met Rose Red. She was evidently in trouble, for she looked flushed and excited, and was under escort of Miss Barnes, who marched before her with the air of a policeman. As she passed the girls, Rose opened her eyes very wide and made a face expressive of dismay. "What's the matter?" whispered Clover. Rose only made another grimace, clawed with her fingers at Miss Barnes's back, and vanished down the entry which led to Mrs. Florence's room. They stood looking after her. "Oh, dear," sighed Clover, "I'm so afraid Rose is in a scrape." They walked on toward Quaker Row. In the washroom was a knot of girls, with their heads close together, whispering. When they saw Katy and Clover they became silent and gazed at them curiously. "What has Rose Red gone to Mrs. Florence about?" asked Clover, too anxious to notice the strange manner of the girls. But at that moment she caught sight of something which so amazed her that she forgot her question. It was nothing less than her own trunk with CEC at the end, being carried along the entry by two men. Miss Jane followed close behind, with her arms full of clothes and books. Katy's well-known scarlet pincushion topped the pile. In Miss Jane's hand were Clover's comb and brush. "Why, what does this mean?" gasped Clover, as she and Katy darted after Miss Jane, who had turned into one of the rooms. It was number 1, at the head of the row, a room which no one had wanted, on account of its smallness and lack of light. The window looked out on a brick wall not 10 feet away. There was never a ray of sun to make it cheerful, and Mrs. Nipson had converted it into a storeroom for empty trunks. The trunks were taken away now, and the bed was strewn with Katy's and Clover's possessions. "Miss Jane, what is the matter? What are you moving our things for?" exclaimed the girls in great excitement. Miss Jane laid down her load of dress and looked at them sternly. "You know the reason as well as I do," she said icily. "No, I don't. I haven't the least idea what you mean," cried Katy. "Oh, please be careful," as Miss Jane flung a pair of boots on top of Cousin Helen's vase. "You'll break it." "Dear, dear! Clover, there's your cologne bottle tipped over, and all the cologne spilt. What does it mean? Is our room going to be painted, or what?" "Your room," responded Miss Jane, "is for the future to be this: number 1. Miss Benson and Miss James will take number 6, and, it is to be hoped, will conduct themselves more properly than you have done." "Than we have done?" cried Katy, hardly believing her ears. "Do not repeat my words in that rude way," said Miss Jane tartly. "Yes, than you have done." "But what have we done? There is some dreadful mistake. Do tell us what you mean, Miss Jane. We have done nothing wrong, so far as I know." "Indeed," replied Miss Jane sarcastically, "your ideas of right and wrong must be peculiar. I advise you to say no more on the subject, but be thankful that Mrs. Florence keeps you in the school at all, instead of dismissing you. Nothing but the fact that your home is at such a distance prevents her from doing so." Katy felt as if all the blood in her body were turned to fire as she heard these words, and met Miss Jane's eyes. Her old hasty temper, which had seemed to die out during years of pain and patience, flashed into sudden life, as a smouldering coal flashes when you least expect it into flame. She drew herself up to her full height, gave Miss Jane a look of scorching indignation, and, with a rapid impulse, darted out of the room and along the hall toward Mrs. Florence's door. The girls she met scattered from her path right and left. She looked so tall and moved so impetuously that she absolutely frightened them. "Come in," said Mrs. Florence, in answer to her sharp, quivering knock. Katy entered. Rose was not there, and Mrs. Florence and Mrs. Nipson sat together, side by side, in close consultation. "Mrs. Florence," said Katy, too much excited to feel in the least afraid, "will you please tell me why our things are being changed to number 1? Mrs. Florence flushed with anger. She looked Katy all over for a minute before she answered. Then she said, in a severe voice, "It is done by my orders, and for good and sufficient reasons. What those reasons are you know as well as I." "No, I don't," replied Katy, as angry as Mrs. Florence. "I haven't the least idea what they are, and I insist on knowing." "I cannot answer questions put in such an improper manner," said Mrs. Florence, with a wave of the hand which meant that Katy was to go. But Katy did not stir. "I am sorry if my manner was improper," she said, trying to speak quietly, "but I think I have a right to ask what this means. If we are accused of doing wrong, it is only fair to tell us what it is." Mrs. Florence only waved her hand again, but Mrs. Nipson, who had been twisting uneasily in her chair, said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Florence, but perhaps it would be better— would satisfy Miss Carr better, if you were to be explicit." "It does not seem to me that Miss Carr can be in any need of explanation," replied Mrs. Florence. "When a young lady writes underhand notes to gentlemen, and throws them from her window, and they are discovered, she must naturally expect that persons of correct ideas will be shocked and disgusted. Your note to Mr. Abernathy Searles, Miss Carr, was found by his mother while mending his pocket, and was handed by her to me. After this statement, you will hardly be surprised that I do not consider it best to permit you to room longer on that side of the house. I did not suppose I had a girl in my school capable of such conduct." For a moment Katy was too much stunned to speak. She took hold of a chair to steady herself, and her color changed so quickly from red to pale and back again to red that Mrs. Florence and Mrs. Nipson, who sat watching her, might be pardoned for thinking that she looked guilty. As soon as she recovered her voice she stammered out, "But I didn't. I never did. I haven't written any note. I wouldn't for the world. Oh, Mrs. Florence, please believe me." "I prefer to believe the evidence of my eyes," replied Mrs. Florence, as she drew a paper from her pocket. "Here is the note. I suppose you will hardly deny your own signature." Katy seized the note. It was written in a round, unformed hand, and ran thus: Dear Barry, I saw you last night on the green. I think you are splendid. All the nuns think so. I look at you very often out of my window. If I let down a string, would you tie a cake to it like that kind which you threw to Mary Andrews last term? Tie 2 cakes, please, one for me and one for my roommate. The string will be at the end of the row. Miss Carr. In spite of her agitation, Katy could hardly keep back a smile as she read this absurd production. Mrs. Florence saw the smile, and her tone was more severe than ever, as she said, "Give that back to me, if you please. It will be my justification with your father if he objects to your change of room." "But, Mrs. Florence," cried Katy, "I never wrote that note. It isn't my handwriting. It isn't my— Oh, surely you can't think so. It's too ridiculous." "Go to your room at once," said Mrs. Florence, "and be thankful that your punishment is such a mild one. If your home were not so distant, I should write to ask your father to remove you from the school, instead of which I merely put you on the other side of the entry, out of reach of further correspondence of this sort." "But I shall write to him, and he will take us away immediately," cried Katy, stung to the quick by this obstinate injustice. "I will not stay, neither shall Clover, where our word is disbelieved, and we are treated like this. Papa knows. Papa will never doubt us a moment when we tell him that this isn't true." With these passionate words she left the room. I do not think that either Mrs. Florence or Mrs. Nipson felt very comfortable after she was gone. That was a dreadful afternoon. The girls had no heart to arrange No. 1 nor do anything toward making it comfortable, but lay on the bed in the midst of their belongings, crying, and receiving visits of condolence from their friends. The S.S.U.C. meeting was put off. Katy was in no humor to act as president, or Clover to read her funny poem. Rose and Mary Silver sat by, kissing them at intervals and declaring that it was a shame, while the other members dropped in one by one to re-echo the same sentiments. "If it had been anybody else," said Alice Gibbons, "but Katy of all persons, it is too much." "So I told Mrs. Florence," sobbed Rose Red. "Oh, why was I born so bad? If I'd always been good and a model to the rest of you, perhaps she'd have believed me instead of scolding harder than ever." The idea of Rose as a model made Clover smile in the midst of her dolefulness. "It's an outrageous thing," said Ellen Gray. "If Mrs. Florence only knew it, you two have done more to keep the rest of us steady than any girls in school." "So they have," blubbered Rose, whose pretty face was quite swollen with crying. "I've been getting better and better every day since they came." She put her arms round Clover as she spoke and sobbed harder than ever. It was in the midst of this excitement that Miss Jane saw fit to come in and inspect the room. When she saw the crying girls and the general confusion of everything, she was very angry. "I shall mark you both for disorder," she said. "Get off the bed, Miss Carr. Hang your dresses up at once, Clover, and put your shoes in the shoe bag. I never saw anything so disgraceful. All these things must be in order when I return 15 minutes from now, or I shall report you to Mrs. Florence." "It's of no consequence what you do. We are not going to stay," muttered Katy. But soon she was ashamed of having said this. Her anger was melting and grief taking its place. "Oh, papa, papa, Elsie, Elsie," she whispered to herself, as she slowly hung up the dresses, and, unseen by the girls, she hid her face in the folds of Clover's gray alpaca and shed some hot tears. Till then she had been too angry to cry. This softer mood followed her all through the evening. Clover and Rose sat by, talking over the affair, and keeping their wrath warm with discussion. Katy said hardly a word. She felt too weary and depressed to speak. "Who could have written the note?" asked Clover again and again. It was impossible to guess. It seemed absurd to suspect any of the older girls, but then, as Rose suggested, the absurdity as well as the signature might have been imitated to avoid detection. "I know one thing," remarked Rose, "and that is that I should like to kill Mrs. Searles. Horrid old thing, peeping and prying into pockets. She has no business to be alive at all." Rose's ferocious speeches always sounded especially comical when taken in connection with her pink cheeks and her dimples. "Shall you write to papa tonight, Katy?" asked Clover. Katy shook her head. She was too heavy-hearted to talk. Big tears rolled down unseen and fell upon the pillow. After Rose was gone and the candle out, she cried herself to sleep. Waking early in the dim dawn, she lay and thought it over, Clover slumbering soundly beside her meanwhile. "Morning brings counsel," says the old proverb. In this case it seemed true. Katy, to her surprise, found a train of fresh thoughts filling her mind which were not there when she fell asleep. She recalled her passionate words and feelings of the day before. Now that the mood had passed, they seemed to her worse than the injury which provoked them. Quick-tempered and generous people often experience this. It was easier for Katy to forgive Mrs. Florence, because it was needful also that she should forgive herself. "I said I would write to papa to take us away," she thought. "Why did I say that? What good would it do? It wouldn't make anybody disbelieve this hateful story. They'd only think I wanted to get away because I was found out. And papa would be so worried and disappointed. It has cost him a great deal to get us ready and send us here, and he wants us to stay a year. If we went home now, all the money would be wasted. And yet how horrid it is going to be after this! I don't feel as if I could ever bear to see Mrs. Florence again. I must write. But then," her thoughts flowed on, "home wouldn't seem like home if we went away from school in disgrace, and knew that everybody here was believing such things. Suppose, instead, I were to write to papa to come on and make things straight. He'd find out the truth, and force Mrs. Florence to see it. It would be very expensive, though. And I know he oughtn't to leave home again so soon. Oh, dear, how hard it is to know what to do." "What would Cousin Helen say?" she continued, going in imagination to the sofa side of the dear friend who was to her like a second conscience. She shut her eyes and invented a long talk, her questions, Cousin Helen's replies. But as everybody knows, it is impossible to play croquet by yourself and be strictly impartial to all the 4 balls. Katy found that she was making Cousin Helen play, that is, answer, as she herself wished, and not, as something whispered, as she would answer were she really there. "It is just the little scholar over again," she said half aloud. "I can't see. I don't know how to act." She remembered the dream she once had, of a great beautiful face and a helping hand. "And it was real," she murmured, "and just as real and just as near now as then." The result of this long meditation was that, when Clover woke up, she found Katy leaning over, ready to kiss her for good morning, and looking bright and determined. "Clovy," she said, "I've been thinking, and I'm not going to write to papa about this affair at all." "Aren't you? Why not?" asked Clover, puzzled. "Because it would worry him and be of no use. He would come on and take us right away, I'm sure, but Mrs. Florence and all the teachers and a great many of the girls would always believe that this horrid, ridiculous story is true. I can't bear to have them. Let's stay instead, and convince them that it isn't. I think we can." "I would a great deal rather go home," said Clover. "It won't ever be nice here again. We shall have this dark room, and Miss Jane will be more unkind than ever, and the girls will think that you wrote that note, and Lily Page will say hateful things." She buttoned her boots with a vindictive air. "Never mind," said Katy, trying to feel brave. "I don't suppose it will be pleasant, but I'm pretty sure it's right, and Rosie and all the girls we really care for know how it is." "I can't bear it," sighed Clover, with tears in her eyes. "It is so cruel that they should say such things about you." "I mean that they shall say something quite different before we go away," replied Katy, stroking her hair. "Cousin Helen would tell us to stay, I'm pretty sure. I was thinking about her just now, and I seemed to hear her voice in the air saying over and over, 'Live it down, live it down, live it down.'" She half sang this, and took 2 or 3 dancing steps across the room. "What a girl you are," said Clover, consoled by seeing Katy look so bright. Mrs. Florence was surprised that morning, as she sat in her room, by the appearance of Katy. She looked pale, but perfectly quiet and gentle. "Mrs. Florence," she said, "I've come to say that I shall not write to my father to take us away, as I told you I should." Mrs. Florence bowed stiffly by way of answer. "Not," went on Katy, with a little flash in her eyes, "that he would hesitate or doubt my word one moment if I did. But he wished us to stay here a year, and I don't want to disappoint him. I'd rather stay. And Mrs. Florence, I'm sorry I was angry and felt that you were unjust." "And today you own that I was not?" "Oh, no," replied Katy, "I can't do that. You were unjust, because neither Clover nor I wrote that note. We wouldn't do such a horrid thing for the world, and I hope that some day you will believe us. But I oughtn't to have spoken so." Katy's face and voice were so truthful as she said this that Mrs. Florence was almost shaken in her opinion. "We will say no more about the matter," she remarked in a kinder tone. "If your conduct is perfectly correct in future, it will go far to make this forgotten." Few things are more aggravating than to be forgiven when one has done no wrong. Katy felt this as she walked away from Mrs. Florence's room, but she would not let herself grow angry again. "Live it down," she whispered as she went into the schoolroom. She and Clover had a good deal to endure for the next 2 or 3 weeks. They missed their old room with its sunny window and pleasant outlook. They missed Rose, who, down at the far end of Quaker Row, could not drop in half so often as had been her custom. Miss Jane was especially grim and sharp, and some of the upstairs girls, who resented Katy's plain speaking and the formation of a society against flirting, improved the chance to be provoking. Lily Page was one of these. She didn't really believe Katy guilty, but she liked to tease her by pretending to believe it. "Only to think of the president of the Saintly Stuck-up Society being caught like this," she remarked maliciously. "What are our great reformers coming to? Now, if it had been a sinner like me, no one would be surprised." All this, naturally, was vexatious. Even sunny Clover shed many tears in private over her mortifications. But the girls bore their trouble bravely, and never said one syllable about the matter in their letters home. There were consolations, too, mixed with the annoyances. Rose Red clung to her two friends closely, and loyally fought their battles. The S.S.U.C. to a girl rallied round its chief. After that sad Saturday the meetings were resumed with as much spirit as ever. Katy's steadiness and uniform politeness and sweet temper impressed even those who would have been glad to believe a tale against her, and in short time the affair ceased to be a subject for discussion, was almost forgotten, in fact, except for a sore spot in Katy's heart, and one page in Rose Red's album, upon which, under the date of that fatal day, were written these words, headed by an appalling skull and crossbones in pen and ink: "Nota bene. Pay Miss Jane off." End of chapter 7. Of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 8. Changes. "Clover! Where's Clover?" cried Rose Red, popping her head into the schoolroom where Katy sat writing her composition. "Oh, Katy, there you are! I want you too. Come down to my room right away. I've such a thing to tell you." "What is it? Tell me too," said Bella Arkwright. Bella was a veritable little pitcher, of the kind mentioned in the proverb, and had an insatiable curiosity to know everything that other people knew. "Tell you, miss? I should really like to know why," replied Rose, who was not at all fond of Bella.
"You're real mean and real unkind," whined Bella. "You think you're a great grown-up lady and can have secrets, but you ain't. You're a little girl too, most as little as me, so there."
Rose made a face at her, and a sort of growling rush, which had the effect of sending Bella screaming down the hall. Then, returning to the schoolroom, "Do come, Katy," she said. "Find Clover, and hurry. Really and truly I want you. I feel as if I should burst if I don't tell somebody right away what I found out." Katy began to be curious. She went in pursuit of Clover, who was practicing in one of the recitation rooms, and the three girls ran together down Quaker Row. "Now," said Rose, locking the door and pushing forward a chair for Katy and another for Clover, "swear that you won't tell, for this is a real secret, the greatest secret that ever was, and Mrs. Florence would flay me alive if she knew that I knew." She paused to enjoy the effect of her words, and suddenly began to snuff the air in a peculiar manner. "Girls," she said solemnly, "that little wretch of a Bella is in this room. I am sure of it." "What makes you think so?" cried the others, surprised. "I smell that dreadful pomatum she puts in her hair. Don't you notice it? She's hidden somewhere." Rose looked sharply about for a minute, then made a pounce, and from under the bed dragged a small kicking heap. It was the guilty Bella. "What were you doing there, you bad child?" demanded Rose, seizing the kicking feet and holding them fast.
"I don't care," blubbered Bella. "You wouldn't tell me your secret. You're a real horrid girl, Rose Red. I don't love you a bit."
"Your affection is not a thing which I particularly pine for," retorted Rose, seating herself and holding the culprit before her by the ends of her short pigtails. "I don't want little girls who peep and hide to love me. I'd rather they wouldn't. Now listen. Do you know what I shall do if you ever come again into my room without leave? First, I shall cut off your hair, pomatum and all, with my penknife." Bella screamed. "And then I shall turn myself into a bear, a great brown bear, and eat you up." Rose pronounced this threat with tremendous energy and accompanied it with a snarl which showed all her teeth. Bella roared with fright, twitched away her pigtails, unlocked the door, and fled, Rose not pursuing, but sitting comfortably in her chair and growling at intervals till her victim was out of hearing. Then she rose and bolted the door again. "How lucky that the imp is so fond of that smelly pomatum," she remarked. "One always knows where to look for her. It's as good as a bell round her neck. Now for the secret. You promise not to tell. Well then, Mrs. Florence is going away week after next, And what's more, she's going to be married." "Not really?" cried the others. "Really and truly. She's going to be married to a clergyman." "How did you find out?" "Why, it's the most curious thing. You know my blue lawn which Miss James is making. This morning I went to try it on, Miss Barnes with me, of course, and while Miss James was fitting the waist, Mrs. Seacombe came in and sat down on the sofa by Miss Barnes. They began to talk, and pretty soon Mrs. Seacombe said, 'What day does Mrs. Florence go?' 'Thursday week,' said Miss Barnes. She sort of mumbled it and looked to see if I were listening. I wasn't, but of course after that I did, as hard as I could." "And where does the important event take place?" asked Mrs. Seacombe. "She's so funny with her little bit of a mouth and her long words. She always looks as if each of them was a big pill and she wanted to swallow it and couldn't." "In Louisbourg, at her sister's house," said Miss Barnes. She mumbled more than ever, but I heard. "What a deplorable loss she will be to our limited circle," said Mrs. Seacombe. I couldn't imagine what they meant. "But don't you think, when I got home, there was this letter from Sylvia, and she says, 'Your adored Mrs. Florence is going to be married. I'm afraid you'll all break your hearts about it. Mother met the gentleman at a party the other night. She says he looks clever, but isn't at all handsome, which is a pity, for Mrs. Florence is a raving beauty in my opinion. He's an excellent preacher, we hear, and won't she manage the parish to perfection?' How shall you like being left to the tender mercies of Mrs. Nipson?" "Now, did you ever hear anything so droll in your life?" went on Rose, folding up her letter. "Just think of those two things coming together on the same day. It's like a sum in arithmetic with an answer which proves the sum, isn't it?" Rose had counted on producing an effect, and she certainly was not disappointed. The girls could think and talk of nothing else for the remainder of that afternoon. It was a singular fact that before 2 days were over every scholar in the school knew that Mrs. Florence was going to be married. How the secret got out nobody could guess. Rose protested that it wasn't her fault. She had been a miracle of discretion, a perfect sphinx. But there was a guilty laugh in her eyes, and Katy suspected that the sphinx had unbent a little. Nothing so exciting had ever happened at the nunnery before. Some of the older scholars were quite inconsolable. They bemoaned themselves and got together in corners to enjoy the luxury of woe. Nothing comforted them but the project of getting up a testimonial for Mrs. Florence. What this testimonial should be caused great discussion in the school. Everybody had a different idea, and everybody was sure that her idea was better than anybody else's. All the school contributed. The money collected amounted to nearly $40, and the question was, what should be bought? Every sort of thing was proposed. Lily Page insisted that nothing could possibly be so appropriate as a bouquet of wax flowers and a glass shade to put over it. There was a strong party in favor of spoons. Annie Silsby suggested a statue, somebody else a clock. Rose Red was for a cabinet piano, and Katy had some trouble in convincing her that $40 would not buy one. Bella demanded that they should get an organ. "You can go along with it as a monkey," said Rose, which remark made Bella caper with indignation. At last, after long discussion and some quarreling, a cake basket was fixed upon. Sylvia Redding happened to be making a visit in Boston, and Rose was commissioned to write and ask her to select the gift and send it up by express. The girls could hardly wait till it came. "I do hope it will be pretty, don't you?" they said over and over again. When the box arrived, they all gathered to see it opened. Esther Dearborn took out the nails, half a dozen hands lifted the lid, and Rose unwrapped the tissue paper and displayed the basket up to general view. "Oh, what a beauty!" cried everybody. It was woven of twisted silver wire. 2 figures of children with wings and garlands supported the handle on either side. In the middle of the handle were a pair of silver doves, billing and cooing in the most affectionate way over a tiny shield on which were engraved Mrs. Florence's initials. "I never saw one like it. Doesn't it look heavy?" cried a chorus of voices, as Rose, highly gratified, held up the basket. "Who shall present it?" asked Louisa Agnew. "Rose Red," said some of the girls. "No, indeed, I'm not tall enough," protested Rose. "It must be somebody who'd kind of sweep into the room and be impressive. I vote for Katy." "Oh, no," said Katy, shrinking back. "I shouldn't do it at all well. Suppose we put it to a vote." Ellen Gray cut some slips of paper, and each girl wrote a name and dropped it into the box. When the votes were counted, Katy's name appeared on all but 3. "I propose that we make this vote unanimous," said Rose, highly delighted. The girls agreed, and Rose, jumping on a chair, exclaimed, "3 cheers for Katy Carr! Keep time, girls! 1, 2, hip, hip, hurrah!" The hurrahs were given with enthusiasm, for Katy, almost without knowing it, had become popular. She was too much touched and pleased to speak at first. When she did, it was to protest against her election. Esther would do it beautifully, she said, and I think Mrs. Florence would like the basket better if she gave it. You know, ever since—" She stopped. Even now she could not refer with composure to the affair of the note. "Oh," cried Louisa, "she's thinking of that ridiculous note Mrs. Florence made such a fuss about. As if anybody supposed you wrote it, Katy. I don't believe even Miss Jane is such a goose as that. Anyway, if she is, that's one reason more why you should present the basket, to show that we don't think so." She gave Katy a kiss by way of period. "Yes, indeed, you're chosen and you must give it," cried the others. "Very well," said Katy, extremely gratified. "What am I to say?" "We'll compose a speech for you," replied Rose. "Sugar your voice, Katy, and whatever you do, stand up straight. Don't crook over as if you thought you were tall. It's a bad trick you have, child, and I'm always sorry to see it," concluded Rose with the air of a wise mamma giving a lecture. It is droll how much can go on in a school unseen and unsuspected by its teachers. Mrs. Florence never dreamed that the girls had guessed her secret. Her plan was to go away as if for a visit, and leave Mrs. Nipson to explain at her leisure. She was therefore quite unprepared for the appearance of Katy, holding the beautiful basket, which was full of fresh roses, crimson, white, and pink. I am afraid the rules of the S.S.U.C. had been slightly relaxed to allow of Rose Red's getting these flowers. Certainly they grew nowhere in Hillsover except in Professor Seacombe's garden. "The girls wanted me to give you this, with a great deal of love from us all," said Katy, feeling strangely embarrassed and hardly venturing to raise her eyes. She set the basket on the table. "We hope that you will be happy," she added in a low voice, and moved toward the door. Mrs. Florence had been too much surprised to speak, but now she called, "Wait, come back a moment." Katy came back. Mrs. Florence's cheeks were flushed. She looked very handsome. Katy almost thought there were tears in her eyes. "Tell the girls that I thank them very much. Their present is beautiful. I shall always value it." She blushed as she spoke, and Katy blushed too. It made her shy to see the usually composed Mrs. Florence so confused. "What did she say? What did she say?" demanded the others, who were collected in groups round the schoolroom door to hear a report of the interview. Katy repeated her message. Some of the girls were disappointed. "Is that all?" they said. "We thought you would stand up and make a speech." "Or a short poem," put in Rose Red. "A few stanzas thrown off on the spur of the moment, like this, for instance: Thank you kindly for your basket, which I didn't mean to ask it, but I'll very gladly take it, and when 'tis full of cake it will frequently remind me of the girls I left behind me." There was a universal giggle, which brought Miss Jane out of the schoolroom. "Order!" she said, ringing the bell. "Young ladies, what are you about? Study hour has begun." "We're so sorry Mrs. Florence is going away," said some of the girls. "How did you know that she is going?" demanded Miss Jane sharply. Nobody answered. Next day Mrs. Florence left. Katy saw her go with a secret regret. "If only she would have said that she didn't believe I wrote that note," she told Clover. "I don't care what she believes. She's a stupid, unjust woman," replied independent little Clover. Mrs. Nipson was now in sole charge of the establishment. She had never tried school-keeping before, and had various pet plans and theories of her own, which she had only been waiting for Mrs. Florence's departure to put into practice. One of these was that the school was to dine 3 times a week on pudding and bread and butter. Mrs. Nipson had a theory, very convenient and economical for herself, but highly distasteful to her scholars, that it was injurious for young people to eat meat every day in hot weather. The puddings were made of batter, with a sprinkling of blackberries or raisins. Now, rising at 6 and studying 4 hours and a half on a light breakfast has a wonderful effect on the appetite, as all who have tried it will testify. The poor girls would go down to dinner as hungry as wolves, and eye the large, pale slices on their plates with a wrath and dismay which I cannot describe. Very thick the slices were, and there was plenty of thin sugared sauce to eat with them, and plenty of bread and butter. But somehow the whole was unsatisfying, and the hungry girls would go upstairs almost as ravenous as when they came down. The second table lights were always hanging over the balusters to receive them, and when to the demand, "What did you have for dinner?" "Pudding," was answered, a low groan would run from one to another, and a general gloom seemed to drop down and envelop the party. It may have been in consequence of this experience of starvation that the orders for 4th of July were that year so unusually large. It was an old custom in the school that the girls should celebrate the national independence by buying as many goodies as they liked. There was no candy shop in Hillsover, so Mrs. Nipson took the orders and sent to Boston for the things, which were charged on the bills with other extras. Under these blissful circumstances the girls felt that they could afford to be extravagant, and made out their lists regardless of expense. Rose Red's for this 4th ran thus: 2 pounds of chocolate caramels, 2 pounds of sugar almonds, 2 pounds of lemon drops, 2 pounds of mixed candy, 2 pounds of macaroons, a dozen oranges, a dozen lemons, a drum of figs, a box of French plums, a loaf of almond cake. The result of this liberal order was that after the great wash-basket of parcels had been distributed, and the school had rioted for 24 hours upon these unaccustomed luxuries, Rose was found lying on her bed, ghastly and pallid. "Never speak to me of anything sweet again so long as I live," she gasped. "Talk of vinegar, or pickles, or sour apples, but don't allude to sugar in any form if you love me. Oh, why did I send for those fatal things?" In time all the candy was eaten up, and the school went back to its normal condition. 3 weeks later came college commencement. "Are you and Clover craters to symposiums?" demanded Lily Page, meeting Katy in the hall a few days before this important event. "What do you mean?" "Why, has nobody told you about them? They are the 2 great college societies. All the girls belong to one or the other, and make the wreaths to dress their halls. We work up in the gymnasium, the crater girls take the east side, and the symposium girls the west, and when the wreaths grow too long we hang them out the windows. It's the greatest fun in the world. Be a symposium, do. I'm one." "I shall have to think about it before deciding," said Katy, privately resolving to join Rose Red Society, whichever it was. The crater it proved to be, so Katy and Clover enrolled themselves with the craters. 3 days before commencement wreath-making began. The afternoons were wholly given up to the work, and instead of walking or piano practice, the girls sat plaiting oak leaves into garlands many yards long. Baskets of fresh leaves were constantly brought in, and there was strife between the rival societies as to which should accomplish most. It was great fun, as Lily had said, to sit there amid the green boughs and pleasant leafy smells, a buzz of gay voices in the air, and a general sense of holiday. The gymnasium would have furnished many a pretty picture for an artist during those 3 afternoons, only, unfortunately, no artist was let in to see it. One day Rose Red, emptying a basket, lighted upon a white parcel hidden beneath the leaves. "Lemon drops!" she exclaimed, applying finger and thumb with all the dexterity of Jack Horner. "Here, crater girls, here's something for you. Don't you pity the symposiums?" But next day a big package of peppermints appeared in the symposium basket, so neither society could boast advantage over the other. They were pretty nearly equal, too, in the quantity of wreath made, the craters measuring 900 yards and the symposiums 902. As for the halls, which they were taken over to see the evening before commencement, it was impossible to say which was most beautifully trimmed. Each faction preferred its own, and President Searles said that both did the young ladies credit. They all sat in the gallery of the church on commencement day and heard the speeches. It was very hot, and the speeches were not exactly interesting, being on such subjects as the influence of a republic on men of letters and the abstract law of justice as applied to human affairs. But the music and the crowd and the spectacle of 600 ladies all fanning themselves at once were entertaining, and the girls would not have missed them for the world. Later in the day another diversion was afforded them by the throngs of pink and blue ladies and white-gloved gentlemen who passed the house on their way to the president's levee. But they were not allowed to enjoy this amusement long, for Miss Jane, suspecting what was going on, went from room to room and ordered everybody summarily off to bed. With the close of commencement day a deep sleep seemed to settle over Hillsover. Most of the professors' families went off to enjoy themselves at the mountains or the seaside, leaving their houses shut up. This gave the village a drowsy and deserted air. There were no boys playing balls on the common or swinging on the college fence, no look of life in the streets. The weather continued warm, the routine of study and exercise grew dull, and teachers and scholars alike were glad when the middle of September arrived, and with it the opening of autumn vacation. End of chapter 8.